Welcome everyone to today's Speaking of History. I'm Sue Schneck, the Curator of Education at Heritage Village, and I'm so glad you could join us today to hear Cathy Salustri talk about the original resistance, the Seminole Tribe of Florida. While Cathy is presenting, feel free to type any questions you might have into the chat box, and as time permits, we'll go through them at the end of her talk. And now to introduce you to Cathy a little bit. Cathy Salustri is an author and historian who resides in Gulfport when she isn't exploring locations off the Florida beaten path to include in her writing. She has an MLA in Florida Studies from USF St. Petersburg. In addition to writing travel pieces for various publications, Cathy has also authored the book entitled Backroads of Paradise, written in 2016. Today, she's sharing information, including her almost ready for primetime book entitled The Florida Spectacular. So I'm thinking, Cathy, that some of the content you're sharing with us today is going to be in that book to be released?
Well, this is the one chapter that is a little bit of an anomaly, because I told the Seminole Tribe of Florida, and this is highly irregular. I did tell the historian and the head of TIPO, which is the preservation office, that this would not make it into the book, that I would not write about the Seminole without the council's permission, the tribal council's permission. So I'm in the process of editing this for my editor, and hopefully we'll get the go ahead. But as you'll see, the Seminole tribe's been the victim of a lot of mischaracterizations and outright lies. So I don't want to inadvertently contribute to that. So we hope so, is the short answer.
Okay, wonderful. Well, I'm going to hand it right over to you, Cathy, and welcome, and thank you so much for sharing this with us today.
I am really looking forward to doing it. The very first place I ever spoke about Florida was for Speaking of History. Of course, that was in person, so that was a little bit different. And today we're gonna talk about the Seminole Tribe of Florida. If you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A. Raise your hand. Always happy to answer. I see some names I know here who may be familiar with Zoom. Feel free to jump in with the chat. I'll try and answer as I go. We're gonna try and keep this to an hour today, so I don't want to hold anybody up from getting out on their kayak this afternoon. There's an African proverb that reads, "Until lions have their own historians, tales of the hunt will always glorify the hunter." And not only with the Seminole Tribe of Florida, but the state of Florida, this has been true. We are a very maligned state, and I can, if pressed, trace that back to the idea that when all the colonies to the north of us decided to declare war on Britain, Floridians who were under British control said, yeah, no thanks, we really like having the king. And as a result, I think we've been getting punished for many hundreds of years. However, the Seminole Tribe of Florida is a little bit more of a severe story. There are no shortage of Indian tribes in the United States we have been unspeakably cruel to, and we certainly do not speak of it. But there is one that stands out for being absolutely spectacular, and that is the Seminole Tribe of Florida. I tell people that they were the initial resistance in America. And before we continue, I want to make note too that I am referring to this culture, this race of people, as Indians. That is because I have asked the tribe specifically how they prefer to be referenced, whether they prefer indigenous people, Native Americans, First Nations, and they say Indians. So that's what I say when I talk about them. Of the 562 recognized tribes in North America, there is only one that never signed a peace treaty with the United States government. And for all the good it did the other 561 tribes, you can't really blame them. But that tribe is the Seminole Tribe of Florida. Now, you will find them at the Big Cypress Seminole Reservation. If you head there today, the first thing that really hits you happens well before you turn onto what is called Sam Jones Trail. It's just a very tranquil piece of wilderness. Most of us in Florida kind of resign ourselves to the chatter of paradise, the traffic horns on our interstates, Friday night ball games at the local high school, laughter coming from the local beach bar. And we do this because the trade-off makes it worthwhile, or so we think. That moment of solitude on a beach on a Tuesday morning, the patches of urban wilderness where we can put in a kayak after a long day of work, and all these little tiny moments of Florida. But the most divine moments you can have as a Floridian that's not going to happen in theme parks or on a spring break beach. They will happen in times when you don't expect them. And in this case, it's in one of the poorest counties in the state, and that would be Hendry County. So for reference, here's where you'll find Hendry County. And this is where the Seminole Tribe of Florida has its headquarters. It is the third poorest county in Florida. It is part of the system of the Everglades, and it has just under 40,000 residents. It is a wide open, breathtaking place to visit. Sprawled along the roadside, you'll find just incessant greenery, which you have no choice but to pay attention to, because through most of it, your cell phone isn't going to work. So forget about listening to a podcast, forget about talking on the phone. You're just going to pay attention to the scenery. This is not Everglades National Park, but it is part of the Everglades collection of ecosystems. In the winter, it appears to be a dry green wilderness, but when the summer floods come, the terrain defines itself with different rivulets, creeks, and streams. And I always tell people that other people will tell me Florida is flat, and I will say it's just not as high as you think it is, as you think it should be. Because what happens as the floods come to Hendry County, they carve out little domes of land and go between them. And this dry green expanse becomes a collection of very small islands. And then there's large green savannas. On these domes, the Seminole Tribe of Florida has waged a 200-year war of resistance. We don't talk about it a lot because we like to talk about the winners. And in this case, the United States has not been the winner. There are no winners in this particular battle, but the United States did not do what it set out to do. In 1842, the most expensive military operation the United States government had ever undertaken had nothing to do with the War of 1812. It had to do with this idea that we could, quote unquote, remove all the Indians and move them to Oklahoma. We talk about the Trail of Tears. We don't talk a lot about Florida. The Seminole tribe decided that it was not going to go to Oklahoma, and they were not going to sign any treaties. They were not going to do anything that the United States government asked them to do. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 is what we refer to as the Trail of Tears. And you see all the other, can't call them migratory, they were essentially marches, death marches, where we sent tribes from all over the South and other parts of the country to Oklahoma. We do not talk about this Trail of Tears. This is a very significant one, especially for Florida, because this area that the Seminole have in this map is not wholly accurate either. There were Seminole across Florida. They were spread out across the Southeast. You may or may not remember President Tyler from your high school history. He was essentially a big states' rights guy who opposed Andrew Jackson. He was the vice presidential candidate who landed in office on the Tippecanoe and Tyler 2 slogan, which was actually very, very anti-Indian. We study it and we talk about it in terms of Euro-American history as the first campaign slogan ever used in a presidential race, and this wonderful, horrible battle that we won in Tippecanoe. We're going to get back to the Seminole, but let me explain what this has to do with Tecumseh and another Indian named Tenskwatawa. So William Henley Harrison ran for president of the United States in 1840, and Tippecanoe and Tyler too. Tippecanoe was his call to fame. Tyler was, of course, the vice president. So you've heard of Tecumseh, right? Most people remember Tecumseh. What you don't realize is that he had a brother, and his brother's name was Tenskwatawa, and they were two Shawnee men who had very different paths in life. Tecumseh, even by Euro-Americans, is remembered very much as a skilled warrior, excellent. He was gifted forensically. He was very good at debate. He was well-spoken. I think the quote, "Live your life like the fear of death can never enter your heart," is credited to him. Tenskwatawa, by comparison, shot out his own eye with a bow and arrow. I'm not sure how that happened, but that's how the history books define him. He was never going to be a warrior. However, reportedly, he struggled with alcohol, and after a alcohol-related illness, he kind of he was asleep, might have been a coma, but he woke up and he proclaimed himself a prophet. And he changed his name, which had been Lalawathika, which meant the noisemaker, to Tenskwatawa, which means the prophet. And he talked about visions in which all of the first people, all the tribes who were in North America when the Europeans came to Florida in the 1500s, he wanted them unified under one government. He renounced European ways. He said that we're going to get our lives back the way they were before the Spanish and the British and the French showed up. Now, of course, for a new country trying to expand across all these places these tribes called home, this incidentally was 1804, and there was not a lot of settlement very far west. This would not do. The United States wanted more land, and they wanted the Indians to go. They wanted that land. In 1806, William Henry Harrison was the governor of everything west of the western border of present-day Ohio and Lake Michigan. We called that the Indiana Territory. He laughed at Tenskwatawa. He said very publicly, "You should prove yourself if you're a prophet." Well, what happened next is either the best luck ever or proof that perhaps the first people in North America were a little bit more in tune and a little more aware of science than we give them credit for. This is the path of a solar eclipse, and Tenskwatawa predicted it would happen on the day it happened. So Harrison had drawn all this attention to this man to mock him and ridicule him and paint him as an ignorant Indian. And Tenskwatawa predicted the solar eclipse, and this backfired, of course, on Harrison. Tenskwatawa and Tecumseh gained more followers for their Indian Federation, which was headquartered on the banks of the Tippecanoe River in present-day Indiana. The Federation welcomed any Indians, any indigenous people who promised they would resist the European influence. Now, Harrison never forgot his mistake. He never signed on to Tenskwatawa and Tecumseh's vision. He wanted land, and he thought the Federation was standing in his way, which it was. So in 1811, he directs troops to attack Prophetstown, which was the capital of the Federation in Indiana. Now, accounts differ as to which side won. This is a map so you can see the area we're talking about, and I promise we're getting back to Florida. Accounts differ as to which side won. The Federation actually lost fewer men than the United States government, but they didn't have Facebook. And Harrison just went ahead and said, well, we won that one. And for generations, probably until today, even people believed that Harrison won Tippecanoe. It was the first battle in the War of 1812. Incidentally, the Brits supported the Federation, not the United States government. When Harrison ran for president, this lie that he told became his slogan, Tippecanoe and Tyler too. It was catchy. Wasn't true, but it was catchy. So back to Florida. At this point, things had not gone well for the Indians, but in their favor, Harrison himself. Had he not been such a long-winded orator, historians suggest he might not have died a month after he was inaugurated. His inaugural address went on and on and on, including gems like, this is one sentence, "It was the remark of a Roman consul in an early period of that celebrated republic that a most striking contrast was observable in the conduct of candidates for offices of power and trust for before and after obtaining them." And I'm not going to go on. I can't see you, but I'm sure your eyes are glazing over. He was just long-winded. and there was a storm. He went on for an hour and 45 minutes in the cold with no coat. He died a month later. We say it was because it was cold and it had snowed, but in reality, there was probably some sanitary sewer issues near the White House that might have killed him. Either way, John Tyler becomes president. And this is a problem because he did things differently than the other presidents. Up until this point, our presidents had all been Federalists who favored a strong central government, Democratic Republicans, which was the first iteration of the Republican Party. They opposed a strong central government, or Democrats, which is kind of a splinter group. Essentially, Tyler was the first Whig. Harrison had actually been the first Whig, and he died, so we don't count him. Tyler was the first Whig to do anything in the White House. Whigs, real quick, we won't make you go through too much of this. Whigs were capitalizing on the notion of President Andrew Jackson as King Andrew, so they named their party after the British anti-monarchy party. So they were very much in opposition to all the power they thought Andrew Jackson wanted. So they put themselves out there as a common man. In reality, both Harrison and Tyler came from prominent families. They were not commoners. But here's where things changed. Tyler wasn't really a Whig. He was actually kind of a states' rights guy. The Whigs just added him to the ticket to get Southerners to vote. Because if you recall this time in history, the South wanted to hold on to its slaves and they thought Tyler would do that. So once Tyler was president, the Whigs are freaking out because Tyler's not doing what they want at all. He wouldn't allow a national bank. His cabinet resigned, all but one. And he was kind of left on his own. Now, before he died, or before his presidency, Harrison had negotiated a whole bunch of treaties with the Indians. They were all worthless. We were never going to honor them. In the midst of all this chaos in the White House, Tyler was left to deal with that as well. He stepped into the office when the United States was 6 years into the first phase of the Seminole War. Think of the period of the Seminole War not as three separate wars, but essentially 1811 until the point where we enter the Civil War. So we're in the 6 years into the second phase of this, because the Indians were not moving. They did not want to go. So Tyler's in the midst of all this. He is not liked by anybody. He doesn't have any support of his party. And he's just a little done with the whole thing. So here's a 1919 map that is wrong, and not very wrong, but it's showing 5 primary Indian tribes living in Florida: Pensacola, Appalachia, Tamiqui, Tequesta, Calusa. I was doing pre-pandemic, I was going down to the Seminole Tribe of Florida and doing some research at their museum regularly. And I asked them on my first visit how they related to these tribes. And the head of the preservation office looked at me and said, well, those are just names European gave us. Those are our ancestors. We are not a new tribe in Florida. We have been here as long as there have been people in North America. So that's why I say this map is wrong. But the point of the map is to show you that whatever we as European called them, these people were living all over Florida. They were not confined to the area that we put them in for the Trail of Tears, or even where we think of them today. 12,000 years ago or so, people came to Florida. I tell people that as most people migrated from Asia into North America, we believe they did that across a land bridge that connected present-day Russia with present-day Alaska. A little bit bigger than that, though, because their thinking was it was about a 2,000-mile wide land bridge. People walked into North America, and I say the smartest people, like all of us, kept walking south till they hit Florida. They hunted. Primarily, these people, they were fishing people. They netted. They ate shellfish, they caught fish, they did some farming, they dug irrigation canals. They were a sophisticated people with separate forms of government. And they were very happy until the Spanish came to town. And they wanted to make these people Christian. They wanted to bend them to their will. They wanted them to move away so they could have the land. This did not go well. Now, I want to quickly explain to you how you can think of the Indians in Florida, because if you go to our state's website or you read any popular literature about the Seminole Tribe of Florida, it will tell you that they came to Florida as refugees from other tribes in the 1700s. They started coming here, and that they are all essentially people from other tribes who escaped the Trail of Tears and escaped slaves. And that's all they were. There were no Indians in Florida before that because they were all extinct. That is not true. Think of it this way. When we talk about the Pensacola, the Appalachee, the Calusa, the Garangubi, the Matacumbi, any Indians in Florida or the Southeast. If you go somewhere, if you go to Paris and someone says, "Where are you from?" You'll probably say the United States. Maybe you'll say Florida. If you're in New York and someone says, "Where are you from?" You'll say, "Well, I'm from Florida." If you're in Jacksonville and someone says, "Where are you from?" You say, "Well, I'm from the Tampa Bay area. I'm just west of there," depending on what region you're in. Now, if you're in your own city, say you live in Clearwater and someone says, "Where are you from?" You'll give your neighborhood. That's how I would encourage you to think about these tribes in Florida, because they are all part of the same people. They were not racially diverse in terms of being from another country. They were all Florida's Seminole. They were their ancestors. So going back to the 19th century, the first phase of the Seminole War. 3 Seminole Wars. This is from, I believe, the Florida Center for Instructional Technology, and it is got the wrong verbiage on it. These are the 3 phases of the Seminole War. And again, if you ask the Seminole Tribe of Florida, and I've seen the documentation in their archives, from 1810, 1811 until the Civil War, there was never a time where the US government was not trying to hunt and kill them. So these are just periods of more intense fighting throughout those 48 years. So the first phase of the Seminole War, 1816 to 1818, took place when we were Spanish Florida. But it wasn't the Spanish who were fighting the Seminole. The US government did not care about boundaries. What they did care about was slaves. And they also didn't like Indians. Plenty of escaped slaves did go south to Florida. Some of them did join the Seminole tribe. They are not the bulk of the tribe, but certainly there are what we call Black Seminole. Now, in addition to the Seminole tribe, the Seminole people welcoming these escaped slaves, the Spanish had a very different idea about slavery as well, too. They believed in slavery, they practiced slavery, but they also practiced something called manumission, which meant that you could be born a slave, and after you worked off your debt that you were born into, you could become a free person. So slaves had a very different path in Florida than they did in other parts of what we now think of the United States, because we were under Spanish control. So slaves in Georgia, Mississippi, a lot of the deep South, it was closer to get to Florida. Now, Andrew Jackson used this as an excuse to invade Florida under the guise of wanting to return slaves to their rightful owners. However, he did not go in with the Spanish crown's permission. There was an agreement between the 2 countries that we would not invade Florida. And once he did go there, he would do things like he would fly false flags. He would fly British flags to capture the Seminole, because the Seminole, again, remember, Britain had supported in the War of 1812 and throughout a great deal of our early history, Britain supported any Indians as opposed to the United States. Jackson's excuse for doing this, all these horrible atrocities, was that having Seminole communities so close to the United States border created too much temptation for slaves, and it tempted them to run away when they otherwise would not have. There's a lot more history to that happens, and I have a talk I give about the Seminole War, and we could get into it in that. But essentially, after repeated invasions and very, very, very for show only censures of General Jackson and other people who were active in the US military, the United States brokers a treaty with Spain. Then the Adams-Onis Treaty, they get control of Florida. So that was in 1821. And as you might expect, those escaped slaves and the Seminoles, who were not having the best life in Spanish controlled Florida, but it was definitely better than living under the United States government. Things get worse. The Second Seminole War, the second phase of the Seminole War, starts in 1835. It lasts for 7 years. And why did the fighting intensify? Because there was a treaty that the United States government said that these people had signed, and it came under dispute. What's interesting about this dispute is that accounts from US soldiers, which you can view at the Seminole Nation in Oklahoma, actually say, no, we lied to them. It was not the treaty they thought they were signing. We coerced them into signing something that said that they would move to Oklahoma, but they didn't know. We lied. That's not opinion. Those records exist. So of course, when we start actively trying to relocate these people to Oklahoma, they fight back. So the US had by this point pretty much forced a lot of the Seminole to a reservation near Lake Okeechobee. And then they wanted that land back, and the Seminoles said no. Adjusted for inflation, this phase of the war cost the United States $387.3 million. Seminole were excellent, excellent fighters. On Christmas Day in 1837, 1,000 US soldiers did battle with just a couple hundred Seminole. And it was called the largest and bloodiest battle of the war by our own Florida Department of Environmental Protection. And the reason was very simple. Our soldiers did not know how to fight in the Everglades. You can see here this painting, and I wish I had it larger, Seminole hiding in what I assume is supposed to be the roots of a mangrove tree, a red mangrove. Now, if you've seen the mangrove here in Pinellas County, this might seem a little fanciful to you, but I assure you, as you get down to the southern end of Florida, those mangroves get much larger, and it would have been cramped, but certainly it would have been feasible for the Seminoles to hide underneath the roots and pick out these very easy target of these men dressed in these wool military uniforms paddling through these trails. It was just foolish that the US government thought they could fight in this manner. The Seminole would cut notches into trees to steady their rifles. They cut the grass in front of them short so they could see the approaching armies better. And I'm sure that they probably laughed the minute the approaching infantry took a step off the canoe and went thigh deep into that black muck of the Everglades. Nevertheless, the United States government declares this a success, and the media follows along. We won the Second Seminole War, or we won this battle. However, 1/3 of the American troops were dead or wounded. And remember, in the 1830s, wounded troops in Florida are not going to last long. Seminole accounts put their dead at no more than 12, and maybe another 12 were wounded. So it was definitely a loss for the United States government. But were the Americans successful? If the goal was to take the patch of land north of Okeechobee, perhaps they got some of it. But the Seminole escaped into the swamp, and for the most part have held their land there ever since. There were other battles in that phase of the war, and there was a third Seminole War, and there were horrible, horrible atrocities we did to these people. We put them in a concentration camp on Egmont Key. We marched them to Oklahoma once we got to the mouth of the Mississippi River. We tricked them. We actually would capture the women and children so the men would come out to defend them, so we could capture the men and ship them like cattle to Egmont Key, where we would pen them up in prison until we had enough to get them to the Mississippi River, to get them to Oklahoma. At the end of that all, the Seminole tribe never signed a peace treaty. They have kept a chunk of their land. They are the unconquered nation. Now, granted, they didn't keep all their land. Seminole communities once existed up and down the state along the coast. By removing the tribe from any of the coastal areas, we thrust them into poverty because there was a culture that for more than 10,000 years was a fishing culture. It was an aquaculture. They would net, they would fish, they would spearfish, they would dive, they had a seafood diet. We moved them away from anything they knew, and certainly they suffered. Now, some Seminole were captured. They were sent to Oklahoma along the Trail of Tears. But what happened after that? At the end of the Third Civil War, you look at the date, or the third phase of the Seminole War, the United States turns its attention to the Civil War. And they were really busy with that, kind of forgot about trying to kill the Seminole. After all, Florida and the Everglades weren't the hot battlegrounds for the Civil War. The only point in Florida that was really significant in the Civil War was Key West, and the Union took that quickly. The Confederates, of course, were not going to care about the Indians because they were fighting the Union. The Union had very little interest in this part. Most of the forts you will see in this part of Florida, incidentally, were built to fight Seminole, not for the Civil War. Even Tampa started as a fort, and we let people homestead in Tampa, Hillsborough County, which used to include Pinellas. If they agreed, they would defend the land against Indians. So we invited people down to Florida to, you can have this land for free, just steal it from the Indians and kill them if they try and take it back. So that's always something to remember when someone says they're like a 10th generation Floridian, because not always a great story. So we forgot about the Seminole for a long time. No one really lived in these parts of Florida for a very long time. Until we were done with World War II, we didn't have a lot of people in Florida south of the Panhandle. We had people in the Keys, Miami, and along the coast, but the middle of the state, too many mosquitoes, air conditioning not available. It was easy to pretty much ignore and forget the Seminole. But once we started moving to this part of Florida, once people had air conditioning, once we got out of the Second World War and everything changed, people started coming to Florida. And as these brave new Floridians found their way ever south, the Seminole found themselves dealing once again with white people, this time in mass. During the second phase of the Seminole War, Florida's population wasn't quite 55,000 people. That's not counting the Seminole. By 1950, Florida had almost 3 million residents. As Florida fills up with Euro-Americans, the Seminole then had to start dealing with an issue of land ownership and confinement. To do this, the Seminole and Miccosukee split into two separate tribal nations at this juncture, and the Seminole, who we're focusing on today, occupied the Big Cypress Reservation. Now, you can see, if you look at the two flags of these two tribes, they look very similar. They both have a chickee hut. They have the same colors. They both refer to themselves as Indians. I would encourage you not to think of these as two separate countries as you might Canada and the United States. Think of them almost as different states with very strong state governments. Now, of course, there is no federal government that oversees them, so they're more powerful. But these two tribes are more closely aligned than two separate nations as we think of them from a European point of view would be. The Seminole drew up its own constitution and government, and the United States recognized the Seminole tribe as a sovereign nation in 1957. The Miccosukee took a little bit longer, but they had a really lovely moment where they kind of stuck it to the United States government because the US government was refusing to recognize the Miccosukee as a sovereign nation. So the Miccosukee said, that's fine. Remember, they're in South Florida. They go to Cuba. Probably this figure right here is a little familiar to everybody. That's Fidel Castro. Fidel Castro had no trouble whatsoever recognizing the Miccosukee as a sovereign nation. He told the delegation, who was led by Buffalo Tiger, Castro said that if you people have a hard time and cannot live the way you want to live in the Florida Everglades, you can live in Cuba. The United States then decided it was going to recognize the Miccosukee as a sovereign nation. Now, the independent traditional Seminole Nation still exists in Florida. but they've never been recognized because they haven't asked for it. And that's because they do not recognize the United States as a sovereign nation. So it gets a little complicated. And you add to that, of course, we have the Seminole Nation, which is in Oklahoma. Those are the people who were living in Florida who were forcibly relocated there. They are a separate tribal government. They are genetically similar. They come from the same people, but they, of course, have gotten some other forces in the gene pool over the past 150 years. Now, if you ask people in the tribe, the Seminole Tribe of Florida, they've told me that the United States government still has a vested interest in keeping those two tribes separate. They want the division. And I think it goes back to Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa. That Indian nation, that Pan-Indian Federation, was very powerful very briefly. And the United States government does not want to see that happen again. So we have essentially 4 different tribes that came out of Florida that still exist today, that started out as one people, that were divided up by the United States government, and then, of course, by geography and their own internal politics. So with the Seminole living on reservations in less populated areas of Florida, and the Miccosukee surviving along the trail, Tampa's a little bit of an outlier there, but you can see where we have some reservations. The tribes faced a different sort of war, because as our population grew, the land starts to suffer. Now, remember, we have completely isolated the Seminoles from any of their saltwater fishing culture. Now, they could fish Lake Okeechobee. They are learning to farm. But as the sugar industry moves into Florida and the cattle industry moves north of Lake Okeechobee, the water in Lake Okeechobee grows toxic. The ground is depleted. It has runoff, petrochemical runoff, runoff from cattle ranches, agricultural runoff. The Seminole really can't even farm. They're not able to really take care of their tribe. And this is, of course, something that plays out in different ways across the United States. There's a lot of rights, because legally, that land belongs to the United States government, and we are allowing the Indians to use it. It is an agreement that we have that the Indians have with the government. And I did not realize that till I started really digging into this. And essentially, this tribe is left on this little rectangular stub of land in the middle of Hendry County. Getting their sovereign status didn't bring back their land. It did give them access to the coast. And of course, they are well aware of what's happening to the Everglades, because they've been living in the Everglades system for 12,000 years. They've been living along the coast, but they're also familiar with all of Florida. The tribes communicated, they traded, they weren't isolated. So they saw Florida changing. They had the stories, they had the oral histories, and they could see it because they were dependent on the land. Even today, there is no Publix anywhere near this tribe. There is one gas station, and Billy's Swamp Safari, the museum. People who work there drive more than an hour to get there, but there are people who still live on the reservation. They don't have access to Shipped. They drive to the grocery store is an hour and a half. It is not a culture that doesn't need the land to be pure. And as we move to Florida, we are definitely degrading the land. We are degrading the fresh water. The same thing that's happened to so many tribes, the poverty, diabetes, all these things. Seminole were no different. But then something happened that changed everything. I haven't seen any questions, but I'm wondering if anybody thinks they know what might have changed things for the Seminole Tribe of Florida, and in fact, Indians all over the United States. I'm going to take a sip of water. So if you know, just put it in the chat. Okay, that was more than a sip. You got me. Oh, somebody? 2 people in the chat. Gambling, yes, Beth and Sylvia, good. Casinos, 3 people, fantastic. Specifically, bingo. Most people don't realize, take a look at that line around the bingo hall. In the night, you don't realize this, but the Seminole Tribe of Florida is the reason any Indians in the United States can have a casino. And here's how it happened. In the 1970s, threatened by poverty, no way to really get to those grocery stores, much less afford the food they need. Kind of left alone and isolated. The Seminole tribe opened a bingo hall. This was not your Catholic grandma's bingo game either. This was a high stakes bingo hall. It hit the proverbial gold mine. Early revenue statistics reported $1 million a month. Now, this is in Hendry County. There was a man who was then the sheriff of Broward County, Bob Butterworth, who some of you may remember. He tried to shut down the bingo hall on tribal land in another county. And the tribe said, no, you can't do that. We are allowed to do this. And they took the case, argued the case, won the case. So as their gaming operation grew, other tribes across the country noticed and they said, hey, wait a minute. This could save our people. This could mean the difference between children eating junk food that they can, or whatever, going hungry. This could be our path to having a house where the roof doesn't leak. This is it. So other tribes too start to open up casinos. The Seminole, for their part, lessens its dependence on federal grants. They start to build their own infrastructure. They start to reclaim their destiny. They are in control. Gambling was going to be the way to do it. Now, today, if you live on tribal land, if you are a Seminole Indian who lives on Seminole tribal land, for example, you don't pay the water bill. The profits from the casino take care of making sure everybody living on the reservation has fresh, clean drinking water. You have sewage that is treated, that doesn't contaminate your land. That is just what they do for their people. Of course, the casinos grew much more. In 2006, the Seminole Tribe of Florida bought the Hard Rock International for $965 million. That buy included the hotels, the cafes, and the casinos. And of course, then this catapults the Seminole into the spotlight. Max Osceola Jr. Told reporters, and this is a quote, our ancestors bought Manhattan for trinkets. Our ancestors sold Manhattan for trinkets. We're going to buy Manhattan back one burger at a time. This one burger at a time strategy seems to be working. In 2015, the Seminole Tribe of Florida reported $2.2 billion in gambling revenue. Its efforts have expanded beyond Hard Rock. In 2017, the tribe bought Donald Trump's Taj Mahal and announced plans to reemploy the workforce that Trump's casino could not afford to pay. It also was expected that the tribe was going to remove the gold decor and replace it something more in keeping with the tribe's own style. Hendry County still has some struggles with poverty. In 2016, 25% of the residents of Hendry County lived in poverty, but that's changing. Dr. Paul Backhouse is the director of the Atatike Museum in Hendry County, and he describes it as a generation that's a tribe that is one generation away from poverty. Because when you go there, you will see that some of the homes near the museum seem to be in disrepair. You still see tribal members who struggle with diabetes. And he reminded me when I asked him about all these things that it was still not quite something some people could trust. They didn't grow up with anything. They didn't have anything. Now, certainly newer generations, the younger generations might see it differently. And so it's something that's changing day by day. The money from the casinos is still new, is helping with larger improvements like the sewage infrastructure I mentioned. They built a beautiful new school. They have their own police department. They have community centers. The the tribe takes care of their own. Now, in a spectacular show of kindness, and maybe not kindness, but what they think is right, the upper echelon does not keep the money for itself. If you work, you get a salary, certainly. But you don't get a larger share of the profits of the casino, depending on your station in the tribe. Everybody gets profit sharing from the casino. So every member of the Seminole Tribe of Florida does get an annual profit based on what the casino collects. That is as much time as I can give you without cutting off your question time. So I'm wondering if anybody has any questions, because there's a lot more to this tribe. I'm clearly very impressed with them. I love going down there to go to their research room. It is a very beautiful, beautiful research room from an archive point of view. I can't wait to get back down there after all this. And I've learned a lot. I've been through a lot of their documents, and there has been a lot that we have been lied to about. There is a collection of evidence down there that does prove we did not stop hunting Seminole. The concentration camp on Egmont Key, the woman who escaped, Polly Parker, who escaped up to south of Tallahassee on the way to Trail of Tears and walked back at night to get back to Lake Okeechobee. And most of the tribe today can trace their lineage to her in one form or another. She really did save the tribe. There are all these beautiful stories I can tell you, but I can't fit any of them into the remaining 14 minutes. So I'd like to open it up for questions. Okay, have a question. A few words about Egmont Key. Yes, this is the one. There's a whole separate presentation on this because it's really horrifying and fascinating. Along the way to the Trail of Tears, I mentioned we would capture the Seminole. We would wait to find the women doing something, capture the women and children. We draw out the men. We would load them onto boats. We would take them to Egmont Key, which was a military installation. We would pen them up in prisons. When we had enough of them captured there, we would load them onto steamers. The Gray Cloud was one of them. Stop at St. Mark, south of Tallahassee, for supplies to refuel the boat, wood, and then get to the mouth of the Mississippi and march them to Oklahoma. So Egmont Key makes very little of this if you go there, but it was a concentration camp. And when I say concentration camp, I want to stress the difference between a concentration camp and an extermination camp. Certainly, Seminoles died there. They were not mass murdered. They were simply neglected, not getting adequate health care. It's less of a result. It was simply a collection area. They were concentrating them. And if you look up the definition of a concentration camp, people who are imprisoned without a trial because of their race or the way they look, there's about 6 or 7 things. They were all there. They were all present. And the sad part about Egmont Key is we really don't know where they buried any of the Seminole. The little burial ground you might see if you take a boat over there now is not, that's not where they buried the Seminole. And they can use ground penetrating radar. They believe it might be under the abandoned helipad. The island is dealing with erosion, so it's not necessarily something we're ever going to know. But the tribe itself does make quite a few trips up there. The archaeologists go up there, and I am president of the Historical Society in Gulfport, and we did a boat trip with one of the archaeologists who's now the head historian. And he really did a beautiful job of explaining everything. So I think once we're out of the pandemic, we're probably going to do that again because a lot of people didn't get to go on that trip. And it really is an eye-opener to the popular little state park that pretends it was just a military installation that never did anything bad. Somebody else asked the question, the current relationship between the tribe and the Black population. Thank you, Beth. And I want to just say to you again, everybody, and please hear this, I am not a representative of the Seminole Tribe of Florida. I've been trained in Florida history. I am a writer and a historian, and I have done the research. So I can speak to things that I have found and things the tribe has told me. I unfortunately can't speak to current mores in the tribe. That would really be a question for somebody who's an actual tribal member, perhaps not even an employee. Um, I'm sorry, I can't answer that. I wish I knew myself. But there is still some mistrust, I think, of white people, and honestly, I don't blame them a bit. Nobody wants to be a curiosity for somebody else, and I'm very sensitive to that. So I try not to pry too much. I try and focus on the history. Can Heritage Village sponsor an event? Thank you, Susan and/or Clarence. An event by Dr. Celestri on Egmont Key. I wish I were a doctor. I have a master's degree. I do not have my PhD. Maybe next year I'll go back. It's kind of expensive. But I would love, I don't know if Heritage Village could sponsor it, but I would be happy to work with Heritage Village and Monica Drake through the Gulfport Historical Society. We are the closest point to Egmont Key, other than the St. Pete Beach Gulf beaches. So I would be happy to do that. We would definitely want to bring Dave Scheidecker up if he could. He's the head historian who really has done the archaeological work on the key. I don't know if you saw Susan and/or Clarence. I'm not sure who's here. Last October, I think it was, they found a hollowed out dugout canoe on Egmont Key. That is a tribal artifact. And I want to talk about that too, because I don't know if I made the case enough or presented it strongly enough that the state of Florida and the United States government is telling people, still on its website, that the Seminole tribe is a new tribe and only came here in the 1700s. Aside from being an insult and a minimization of people, this has caused some problems. And in fact, I believe it was a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, the Seminole Tribe of Florida withdrew from it severed ties with the Smithsonian, because the Smithsonian has artifacts and remains, tribal remains, that they would not release to the Seminole Tribe of Florida, because they said, well, this is from before the Seminoles were in Florida. And the Seminole tribe said, no, we have oral history. We have been here. We have always been here. And the Smithsonian says, well, I'm sorry, that's not the narrative. You can't have it back. And the Seminole Tribe of Florida launched and led a campaign called No More Stolen Ancestors against the Smithsonian. And late last year, they were victorious. The Smithsonian changed their policy. That's why getting the history right matters. Very important. I know Monica is not in the audience today, but I will be happy to talk to her. Sue, maybe you can assist with that, and we can talk about maybe getting a trip out to Egmont Key between Heritage Village and perhaps Gulfport Historical or Gulf Beaches. We've worked with the Hubbards before, and it's really just been an amazing thing. So thank you for asking. Do we have any other questions? Any comments? I am, if you can see here on the last slide, whoops, where'd it go? I have a couple of things I want to make you aware of. I have a monthly newsletter that is the Florida Spectacular, and you can certainly subscribe to that. It comes out once a month. I just sent one out this week. I also have a podcast called the Florida Spectacular Podcast. There was an episode earlier this year where I actually did have Dave Scheidecker from the Seminole Tribe of Florida on the podcast. We'll have him back again to talk. They're about 30 to 40 minutes. Wherever you listen to podcasts, you can find the Florida Spectacular. If you have any questions today, if you think of a question later, please email me. I try and answer all my emails quickly. Sometimes it takes a few days, but I do get back to people. I have a website where I post about my travels, Twitter, where I get a little political, Instagram, where I post pictures of my travels and my cats and dogs, and of course, a public Facebook page. So if you think of anything, those are all great ways to reach out to me. I look forward to being back with you, I hope, in person someday soon. And I thank you all for being a part of this talk today. I'll stick around for a few more minutes if anybody has any more questions, and happy to answer them. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Cathy. It was really enlightening. A lot of great information, a lot of truth that perhaps we haven't been exposed to before. So I really thank you for sharing that and being a part of Heritage Village, speaking of history. And yes, please continue to put any questions up, and we'll look at that, and Cathy will get back to you. But thanks again, Cathy, for all this great sharing of information. And
Thanks for asking me to
we
speak.
really look forward to having that chance to have you here in person again as well. So
Thank
thanks
you.
everybody for being here and taking part in this today.